Welcome to Dr. David Jenkins, who's going to give us this online talk today. So Dave is a lecturer in health data science in the Division of Informatics, Imaging and Data Science. Is that right? At the University of Manchester.
Yeah, that's right.
So David is going to pose this question for us today. So do we need time-varying clinical prediction models? So I'm really looking forward to finding out the answer to that question, assuming there is an answer. So yeah, I'll let you go for it, Dave, if you want to share.
Yep. Can you see the presentation mode, the right mode now?
Yep, we can see it. Yeah.
Awesome. I'm just going to move this out of the way a little bit. If you do have any questions or anything, throughout, please feel free to just ask away. More than happy to answer questions as they go along. But if I miss them, do just feel free to unmute or just Joey just shout at me. That's fine. So yeah, as Joey said, I'm going to try and sort of answer this question: are time-varying clinical prediction models needed? So just very quickly, I think Joey already said, but my background, well, I'm in Manchester. I'm actually based at Centre for Informatics within the division Joey just mentioned. And we have a prediction modelling group within that division. So I lead sort of the validation, updating and maintenance of prediction models. Matt Sperrin, who you might be aware of up here, he leads the causal element of it. Glenn reads the multi-outcome prediction, and we all kind of fight over this bit here, which is actually mainly around missing data and how do we deal with missing data. So if anyone is interested in any of those, feel free to just reach out to us. So this talk, I should say, is going to be not very methods based. I'm going to give a whistle-stop tour of a few things I'm working on in the area and have worked on in the area to try and address the problem. And I'm assuming most people have a little bit of an understanding of prediction modeling, but very quickly, so prediction models are these sort of crystal balls that take information from patients, whether that be their age, sex, various biomarkers, etc. And we use them to predict some outcome, whether that be the current or future risk of a health event or status. And typically they can be sort of regression-based models, or more frequently we're seeing sort of machine learning models coming into this field. So that's what I mean by prediction models. And anyone who works in the area will sort of be familiar with this sort of pipeline that a lot of papers talk about. So we develop models, and then once we have a nice shiny crystal ball, let's say, we then validate that model internally, externally. We get this nice tick to say, oh yeah, it's all working well, and then we implement that model in clinical practice, typically through a dashboard or something like that. And the idea is hope that is then used for either patient care, or at least has some impact to patients to improve health outcomes. Now, Euroscore, that some of you might be aware of, it's a good example as to why this is sort of a motivation for this talk, really. So Euroscore is a prediction model that's used to predict mortality following cardiovascular surgery. And the idea is that it is used to determine who should undergo cardiovascular surgery. It was developed so it was actually published in 1999, but it was developed on data from a 3-month time period in 1996, I believe. And then Graham Hickey, the reference down here, he published a paper looking at the observed mortality rate over time and what the model predicts. And the bottom line here is just the ratio of those two. And as you can see, we want the observed expected ratio to be around 1 over time, but you can see even by 2002, the model is not performing very well, what we call miscalibrated. And then that model diminishes just more and more over time. So the model gets worse over time. And then this is a phenomenon called calibration drift that I'm really interested in. And essentially is the motivation for sort of the time variant models I'm going to discuss in a minute. But I just want to highlight 2 things. You will see calibration drift a lot in the literature. Sorry, but most people only really talk about it when it's in the validation stage. One thing I'm really keen to sort of get across is that very often calibration drift is still present in the development data, but it's never considered in the development stage. So I just want to highlight that. I'll come on to that again later. And also, this is not just an element with regards to time. The rest of the talk, I will focus on time, but this problem is also with respect to space. So transporting a model, for example, across geographical regions or countries. As I said, for this talk, I'll focus on time. So what people do is they update their model in some way at some arbitrary time point in the future. And actually, Euroscore updated in 2012. Yeah, 2012. They did say, I think, within this paper that they were going to update again when needed, but we're still waiting for Euroscore 3 to come out. And we're sort of 12 years in from Euroscore 2. But this is widely used in practice today. Another example of a model that's updated is QRisk. So that is actually updated yearly, and every so often they generate these new iterations of QRisk, so QRisk 2 and QRisk 3 that some of you might be aware of, that include additional predictors essentially in the model. But that's updated yearly for the issues of calibration drift. And then the last piece of motivation was this paper that came out by Graham Hickey, if none of you are aware of it. So it was a follow-on from the previous paper that I just mentioned. So he applies various model updating techniques, and he looks at different model updating techniques compared to not updating, and obviously shows model updating is preferred. So essentially it got me thinking, and it started off my PhD about time invariant prediction models. So one of the studies I started out with is essentially, well, what time varying prediction models are there out there? I'd seen a few papers employing various methods. So I wanted to gauge sort of an idea around what is the status and sort of the methodological challenges that need to be addressed further, in the hope that I would tackle sort of some of these as part of my PhD and following on from my PhD. So time invariant models, or at the time what I called basically dynamic models, are models that evolve over time. They basically account for calibration drift by adjusting for the changing case mix in the population. One of the sort of really nice things about them is that they reduce the latency or the lag between when you observe a change in the data to when you react to it, rather than just arbitrarily updating or hoping when you do another external validation study that you would detect that. And another nice thing about some of these models is that you can add a mechanism where you forget data over time, which I think is really nice, because if you are observing changes over time and you are updating the model, then you should forget those previous data rather than weight all individuals equally. However, one of the main things that we found essentially is that these are very difficult to validate, especially if you are updating very frequently. Just as a bit of a plug, really, on the back of sort of this review, our group did a lot of reviews, so methodological reviews in prediction modeling. We did some on causal, multi-outcomes, missing data. We did quite a few, and on the back of it, we ended up writing sort of a framework and how to conduct methodological reviews. So I just wanted to sort of give that a plug. So that's sort of some of our learnings from undertaking some of these reviews and how they differ from standard scoping reviews, essentially. So just very quickly, what are the sort of modeling approaches? I'm not going to go into all the analytical detail because I want to get onto some of the studies, but essentially periodic updating, although this is arguably whether this is time invariant. So this is just like QRisk or Euroscore. You just update the model at a given or regular intervals. Problem with this is it still leaves lag, and I'm calling it time varying here, but I don't really consider it time varying because the model is fixed at every single update before the next update. Bayesian modeling, so this is the really nice approach that I like to employ, but I'm being a bit biased here, you probably guess where we're going with this talk. But essentially, Bayesian modeling offers a way to update with every single observation. Analytically, it's more complex, and essentially it would require a continuous stream of data. And it's a bit difficult to communicate such a model that is being used in practice if it's updating all the time How do you communicate that somebody's risk is changing from one day to the next, for example? The nice thing here is there's no lag. You can instantaneously observe someone's outcome, update the model, and you've got a nice shiny model. And the nice thing with this is you can downweight previous observations, which I'll come on to as well later. The final one is, which wasn't really used much in the literature, I was quite surprised, was varying coefficient models. So these are models that essentially include the regression coefficients as just functions of time. So basically you just include an interaction with time into the model is a simple way to explain them. And the idea is that sort of increases the shelf life of the standard time invariant model, the static model. And what it does is essentially you try and extrapolate the trends in the data into the future time periods. So essentially, are they needed? If so, which ones should we be using? So I wanted to go over just 2 studies that I've been involved in. So the first one is essentially just taking all of those approaches, applying them to a data set, seeing how the performance of that model works. And the second one is a simulation study where we looked at these models under different sort of temporal changes over time. Essentially, we just applied different calibration drift scenarios to the data set and seeing how these models reacted to the idea to provide recommendations to answer this question. For the first study, we used data from Wythenshawe Hospital, collected from the 1st of January 2009 all the way up until middle of 2019. So this includes data on all heart operations, and the outcome was hospital mortality. And essentially what we did is we tried to mimic the development of Euroscore 2. So we used data up until 2011, the end of 2011, to develop the model, and we included all variables that were part of Euroscore 2 in that sort of development data set. And then we had our latter time period from 2012 to middle of 2019 as what we considered our validation data. Or if we were applying model updating, we updated through that time period as well. And I'll discuss that now, or after this actually, I should say. So I just want to show sort of the development of validation data. So and just highlight a few things. So you can see sort of the prevalence of diabetes changes in those basically over time. And where is it down here? Yeah. So the type of surgery being undertaken, more people were being rushed into surgery rather than having elective surgery. There was an increase in those who experienced myocardial infarctions prior to surgery. So it appears to be that over time, sort of, they were seeing more high-risk individuals. So it appears as though there is some calibration drift, or there is some drift in the data, I should say, over time, some distribution change in the data that might mean the model might become miscalibrated. So in terms of the modeling approaches, very similar to what I've just already said in terms of the methods that we're looking at. So we have the time invariant logistic model. So that's just a standard logistic regression model using the development data. We then had a yearly updating model. So every single year we use that full year to update the model. And then we had the Bayesian model, which we updated for which we updated throughout the whole time period, every time we observed a new individual. And we chose this forgetting factor, which downweights all of the previous individuals by this amount, essentially. Now, we chose this, it doesn't seem like we're downweighting very much, but we chose this so that the effective sample size at every single update would be 3021, which matches the development data set, essentially. The idea behind that was just to make it more comparable to the logistic model in terms of the sample sizes being used for both of those models. And then for the variant coefficient model, we use the development data. We had the intercept as a linear function of calendar time, and then we extrapolated those coefficients into the validation cohort. And we assess the performance of these models. Again, I'm making the assumption that everyone knows sort of what these are. So essentially various calibration and discrimination measures. We looked at over the whole validation data set, the performance, and we also looked at the performance by calendar year, so split up by calendar year. And these are the results for the full data. So, sorry. So in the logistic model and the varying coefficient model, what I'm basically showing here is that they are miscalibrated, whereas the Bayesian and yearly updated model, the calibration in the large is closest to 0, which is what we ideally want. The calibration slope, exactly the same thing. We want calibration slope to ideally be 1, and we find that over the whole validation cohort, the varying coefficient model is actually the worst here, even compared to the logistic model. And then the other thing just highlight is that the Bayesian model achieves sort of the highest discrimination in that data. And when we split it up by year, these are the results that that we get. And I just want to highlight in 2014, there's a huge drop in performance, and that is for the logistic model and the varying coefficient model. But actually the yearly updating model and the Bayesian model remain really stable and are not miscalibrated. And it is just worth mentioning that the Bayesian model, this blue one, remains really well calibrated throughout. But there is sort of a miscalibration step for the yearly updated model. So what we're assuming is that something happens in 2014 that makes these models perform really poorly. And then when the model tries to update using this data, the subsequent year provides a miscalibrated model for the yearly updated model. So essentially, the Bayesian model performs really well, but actually just the yearly updating model is pretty good. You might not need to go through all the extra computational issues and get a stream of data. Yearly updating might be sufficient. And in terms of those results, I just summarize them here. Essentially, what we recommend is that time invariant models should be avoided because there are clear calibration issues here, and we find that Bayesian model updating is probably the best where feasible. However, if not feasible, then periodic updating is probably okay. So that's what we concluded from that study, and that study is now published as of last month, I think, for anyone who's interested in taking a more detailed read. And I can share the slides to Joey afterwards in case anyone else is interested. Yeah, so very quickly, we also did a simulation study. So essentially, we took an individual and so each individual is observed once in a data set, then they have a single outcome, and we observe a set of individuals at a given time point t. So this is sort of the vector of outcomes for individuals 1 to nt. And we generated outcomes based upon this linear model. So we have some link function with the expectation of the outcome, and follow this regression equation. But what I just want to say essentially is we allow the intercept and beta 1 to be varying functions of time, but we fix beta 2 over time. This was just looking at 2 predictor variables, which are normally distributed. Very sort of basic sort of simulation study to explore. Obviously, you can make this a lot more complicated. Now we look at a continuous and a binary outcome. And what we did in terms of the simulation is we simulated 2 years of data. So we assume there are 730 time points, being days. And what we did is we assumed the first year was the development data set and the second year was the validation data set. And at each time point, we observe 1, 10, 25, or 100 observations, which gives us sort of these respective sort of sample sizes here. And what we did is we just induced various degrees of drift over time. So various mechanisms for calibration drift and various strengths of calibration drift. So these are the 3 here. We basically assumed that there was no drift over time. So beta 0 was not a function of time. It was just a fixed constant. And then we also assume that beta 0 and beta 1 was linearly increasing over time by some alpha, essentially. So as time increased, you increment the beta coefficient by a certain value. So that's just a linear increase over the whole development and validation, I should say. And then what we also did is we had a step function where the true beta, there was a step change at a given time period within the development or validation data set, if that makes sense. So it remained stable, and then there was a sudden jump in the true beta coefficient for the data generating model, and then that remained stable after that jump. So that's something that's probably less likely to happen unless something like a pandemic really sort of changes something, but it's probably less likely than a sort of a linear change, slow linear change over time. So I realise I'm giving you a very whistle-stop tour to this paper, sorry. So we looked at the modelling approaches that we've already spoken about. So a logistic model, we used a Bayesian model, but in this one, what we did for the forgetting factor is we figured out what the minimum sample size should be, and then we calculated the forgetting factor so that we ensured we always had the minimum sample size. So the way that this forgetting factor works, which I didn't really say, is you can consider it a bit like a sliding window approach. It's not entirely how it works, but you can think about it. You can think about it that way. So we ensure we always had effective sample size, but within the simulation, the Bayesian model always had the minimum viable sample size and no more. And then a varying coefficient model, we considered two things. The intercept was a function of time only, and then all coefficients were functions of time. And then the additional thing we did for the Bayesian and varying coefficient model, we allowed the Bayesian model to update throughout the validation data set, and we also fixed it at the end of the development data set so that the coefficients remain static. And we also did the same thing for the varying coefficient model. We didn't allow it to extrapolate, and we also did a scenario where we allowed it to extrapolate to determine what, the idea was that then to generate recommendations of what we should or shouldn't do with these approaches. So very quickly, for the bind, and this is quite a lot, I'll just try and talk you through some of it. So essentially when there's no change, can you see my mouse at all?
No, I can't see your pointer thing. No, can't see it.
Can you see it now?
No.
How about now?
Yes.
There we go. Okay. So this is when there's no change in the data. So as you say, I don't know whether this is overfitting or not, but there's a sort of smaller confidence interval across 1,000 iterations for the Bayesian model, or whether it is just a more stable model. In terms of linearly increasing drift over time, you actually find that, so these are the two variant coefficient models, ones that are extrapolated into the validation data set, and they perform really well when there's a linear change over time. But when there's a step change, that doesn't perform as well. But compared to the, that should be logistic model. Sorry, I just realized that should be a logistic model. Compared to just the standard time invariant logistic model, the Bayesian model and varying coefficient model actually do appear to perform better. Which is kind of what we expect. We kind of set it up, right, the simulation to do that. And again, even for a continuous outcome, you basically get the same results. When there's a linear change over time, the varying coefficient model is basically awesome. And the Bayesian model not as good, but better than the better than the linear model. So as part of the simulation as well, which we're submitting to Stats in Medicine, we also did another real world case study, essentially. So we applied each of these models again to a national database, which included 1.2 million patients. And that was for people undergoing stents. So anyone who had a stent, the idea was to develop or apply these models to predict mortality. And if we look at calibration in a large again, and we compare sort of the Bayesian model with the other models, the Bayesian model sort of, as you can see from this, outperforms the other models, and it's really stable. I think this is really nice. It's a really stable approach, whereas the others are sort of jumping around. So looking at this, you would say the Bayesian model should be preferred potentially. And for the Bayesian model, we do the one step ahead prediction essentially, and then average over over those. So this is actually the same sort of discussion and recommendations from a previous study. We basically didn't really find much new, apart from we found that the Bayesian model had narrow confidence intervals on the simulation across 1,000 iterations, and the varying coefficient model performed really well, but it only performs well if you know the functional form, which in reality, we never know the true functional form. So that's why we actually still recommend avoiding the varying coefficient model, because there are issues with extrapolation of that model, and that we should work towards trying to have more frequent updates, or if possible, Bayesian model updating. Now, the problem with Bayesian model updating is that we're not quite there yet in terms of I just chose arbitrary values for when to forget a model, and there's still a lot that needs to be done in terms of optimizing this approach essentially. So what should your forgetting factor be is one of the key questions, I guess. So time invariant models, are they needed? So I've still got another 10 minutes, but essentially I would say yes, we should be considering them. Definitely. I don't know, more people aren't doing it really from my point of view. However, I'm sure probably many of you are going, oh, hang on a second, this is just, these type of models are very difficult potentially to implement, and how do we communicate these models? How do we optimize these models? How do we actually even go about deploying these models? And yeah, you've shown that these models perform slightly better, but actually does that translate to patient benefit? And I think this is where we need to move towards thinking for these type of models now, and actually trying to better these models essentially. And I just wanted to, this came out a couple of weeks ago. I don't know if anyone's seen it yet, but do go and take a read. So Florian wrote this paper saying that all models are wrong and yours are useless. And I agree that there are so many models being developed now, but none are being used. But hopefully the use of things like Bayesian model updating will stop just the unnecessary amount of models being developed, and or just unnecessary updates of these models. You just have one modeling process, one model that's updated over time, and hopefully that can help. But actually, sorry, I just wanted to briefly spend, I've got still 10 minutes to talk, Joey.
Yeah.
So a couple of years ago, so obviously we've mentioned this CPM pipeline about develop a model, you validate it, and many years later you update. And I basically just said we should move away from that to more dynamic or periodic updating rather than just arbitrary updating. And along with Richard, actually, a few years ago, I published this paper saying we should move away from this sort of this linear pipeline that we talk about for prediction models and move towards this more sort of learning health system sort of cyclical process where we don't just go along this linear process. And basically what I've just spoken about so far is actually just that part of it, the bit that's highlighted, the model development and model updating. But actually within that paper, I say, well, actually you should be thinking about model surveillance and model validation a little bit more than just simply looking at model development and model updating in isolation. And sort of the reason for that is because I actually don't believe there's any such thing as a validated model. If we believe there's calibration drift over time, or whether there's not, as soon as you validate a model, it's instantly outdated. As soon as you observe somebody new, really, they're a new person. They've never been validated. The data, you've never validated the model on there. So there's no real such thing as a validated model. And I think Ben Van Calster and Martin Masmeden published a paper last year on this topic as well. But another advantage is if you are able to monitor the prediction model through time, you might not need to update all the time. So are time invariant models necessary? I've just said yes, we should be using them, but actually there are scenarios in which they might not be necessary. So in that paper, we actually point towards something called statistical process control. So I just want to spend just 2 minutes going over something that I've done in statistical process control for actually, rather than just focusing on updating, maybe we should switch it and actually monitor models to determine when to update. So this is not a new method by any means, but essentially this is a process to just monitor the efficiency of some process. So you may have something that you're monitoring over time, which is this black line here. Then you have what you call this control chart. So you have this upper and lower limit. Then once this process you're monitoring goes below or above that limit, it then triggers a process. And in our case, it would trigger maybe a model update or someone to intervene or check the performance of the model. And the idea is that this sort of distinguishes between common cause variation, which is just something that we observe every day, compared to more special cause variation. So common cause is just intrinsic of the modeling process, but special cause is what we want to address. And in this case, that is basically calibration drift. So we could do this using statistical process control. And sort of 20 years ago, even Spiegelhalter and a few others sort of proposed using what at the time was called Q-sum or cum-sum charts, not in the context of prediction, but just in the medical field in general. And this is a kind of an example that they have in their paper. So they have some process that they're monitoring, and then they have these control limits, which triggers something. And then here's just another paper that looks at comparing surgeons. So you can use it to compare between surgeons, hospitals, auditing, benchmarking. There's been lots of stuff mentioned in sort of the medical literature, but never really in prediction modeling. So I sort of looked at this a little bit, and just as a quick example, essentially what you can do is, that shouldn't be ratio, ignore ratio, but what you can do is you can look at the cumulative sum of the observed and expected, and you can monitor that under statistical process control. But you'll see here that the control limits are increasing over time. So other literature, not in medical context, has proposed you do this. So the control limit should be based upon the variance that you observe over time rather than just fixed intervals. So the idea behind that is that you fix the type 1 and type 2 error. Essentially, you're fixing the error rates over time. And there's been some suggestions of using 3 or 4 standard deviations. And I actually go a step further, and I proposed in this the study that I'm just writing up now, that actually there are 2 other things that you need to add to this to control for error. Number 1 is a burn-in period. So you don't want just alerts to happen instantly just because of random variation. So you have a burn-in period where we state that N of P should be greater than 5. So this is because the observed outcome is a Bernoulli random variable, and there's a rule of thumb that if that Bernoulli random, if the sum of the Bernoulli random variable, so if N of P is greater than 5, you can assume the data are normally distributed. So we make that assumption in the paper, and we allow some burn-in, which means we do not have a trigger until that threshold is reached. And the other thing is that we have a resetting procedure, which is why you see every time it crosses 0, we're essentially assuming the model is stable and it's performing well. So we trigger a reset of the control limits. And you can see that in this just arbitrary case I've just made up, that you would determine a trigger here that would alert a user, sort of, I don't know, 60-something thousand individuals in. Whereas if you had what we're proposing, you would trigger it a lot earlier, at which there appears to be sort of calibration drift starting. So the idea is that this controls for error and is hopefully useful to determine when to intervene or when to stop using a model, for example. And I did a brief simulation. So I used that the BSIS registry data, so the PCI registry data I mentioned earlier, and I took a risk score that had already been developed on that. And I just used that to generate everybody's linear predictor within the data set and said, this is the true risk. And then what I did is I said, I generated true outcome, well, everyone's observed outcome, I should say, based upon this model here. So I actually just fixed beta 1 to B1. And then what I did is I just induced some level of miscalibration in the large. So beta 0 ranged from no miscalibration all the way up to a sort of miscalibration of 2 in the intercept. So this essentially just is saying if we take a model, we miscalibrate it, and we then validate it using SBC, what is the time at which we can detect miscalibration? And we checked this for 3 and 4 standard deviation control limits. And what I also did was look at the number of persons who within each iteration of the simulation were, if you take a risk threshold, like a treatment threshold, if somebody's risk was above that threshold, but their true risk based upon the data generating model was below that, so if they switch between the threshold because of the miscalibration of the model, then we consider that to be an incorrect treatment decision. So how many people were given incorrect treatment decisions under applying statistical process control using 3 or 4 standard deviation limits, or not having statistical process control? And very, very quickly, if you do take sort of various threshold percentages, I realize these percentages are very low, but that's because the risk of the outcome is only about 0.1%. So these are just for illustration purposes. But this red line is if you have no threshold. Oh, it's cut off the sides. Oh, so actually, what it actually does is if you pick these thresholds, this is about sort of 500 to 200 people throughout the data set that you incorrectly identify. But actually, if you use the 3 and 4 standard deviation control limits, you're actually only incorrectly providing treatment to 5 to 15 people. Even if there's a really small amount of drift, you're not providing, or if there's a large amount of drift, you're not providing many people with incorrect treatment decisions. And then what I also did is just look at the percentage of times each simulation triggered. So this is the percentage in terms of out of 1,000 iterations based upon a miscalibrated model where the intercept was miscalibrated for a value of 2. At what time point had the model triggered out of the 1,000 iterations? So by 500 patients, I should say out of the 1 million patients, even by 500 people, the model had triggered that this model is not working very well. And you'll notice this brief little flat period here for all of them. And that is just because of this burn-in period, essentially, that we propose. So even when there's no miscalibration, you can see that the 3 and 4 standard deviation control limits still produce a trigger, but this is only about 5%, which you might consider perfectly fine, considering we have significance levels of 5%, for example. But we still generate triggers, and actually the 3 standard deviation control limit, as you'd expect, it's a smaller, it's a narrower control limit, so it generates more triggers, up to I think about 10% after 1,000 patients. That makes sense. So I just wanted to show this that I'm working on as another way of thinking about it. So I believe that statistical process control and more monitoring of prediction models is potentially a way to go, and it's a nice way to alert users of when to do something. However, I've only looked at this for observed minus expected ratio. It's a lot more challenging if you actually look at calibration in large, calibration slope, AUC, because the problem is with observed expected ratio, you can do it cumulative, it's additive, it's really easy. You can compute the values for each individual, but you can't do that for calibration in a large. So you'd have to batch data in some way. And there are implications whether you have batches of 10 or 1,000 individuals. So I'm not there yet on providing recommendations for that, but we're currently exploring that. And essentially, care needs to be taken when choosing control limits. So we look at 3 or 4 standard deviations in the paper, but actually we say this should really depend on the implications of getting a decision wrong. So although we talk about continuously updating a model using Bayesian modeling, actually, I think one nice way to go is continuously testing a model. The only problem with this, which is something else I wanted just to make everyone aware of, that just isn't mentioned really much, is the prediction paradox. And this is the last 2 slides, Joey. So, and if anyone's read the Asimov sort of foundation series, but there's a sort of a mathematical historian, I think he's called. So it's Harry Seldon, and he sort of predicts the future of the Galactic Empire, and he states that that only holds if 2 conditions are met. You have a sufficiently large sample, essentially, and the other one is that nobody's aware of the prediction. So this is another reason why I don't believe you can really truly validate a prediction model, because if it's being used in clinical practice, it changes clinical practice. And this is essentially the prediction paradox. So if we predict somebody to be at high risk of something, we intervene on those people, we change their outcome. And so how can we actually continuously monitor a prediction model if we are changing people's outcomes, if that makes sense? So this is a real challenge when it comes to prognostic prediction problems, I should say, that I just wanted to sort of highlight. That is a bit of a stumbling block for me at the minute. So finally, time varying models, are they needed? Yes. Well, maybe sometimes, but actually I think we should probably try and work towards sort of dynamic prediction systems and how do we embed them into clinical practice, as opposed to just a one-size-fits-all approach, if that makes sense. So essentially, there's lots more to do, and I would like to get to be, yeah, I've resolved this question. No research is needed, but obviously I'm not there yet to answer the actual question that I proposed at the start of the talk. I think that's my slides.